The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, the most recent Zelda game which was praised by many. They have been working on this game since 2011, and now it's finally here. It's filled with all kinds of new things and changed the Zelda franchise in a positive way. But why did the creators change certain aspects of the franchise? What inspired them? Did they take any mechanics from earlier games in the series, or completely different ones? Well, let's find out. One of the things that stands out as soon as you start the game is the art style, and this has been used in a couple of Zelda games. But the first time that we saw this was in The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker. Now back in those days, people were pretty angry that this was the new art style, since they showed off a Zelda game a year before with way more realistic graphics, and all of a sudden they changed it to this cartoony look. But what kind of art style is this even? Well, it's called Cel Shading, and I made a video together with Thiefbug about this on my second channel, Game Architects. So let me play a little bit of that video, and you can check out the full video after this one. This is a rendering technique in which elements such as shadowing are not rendered in a gradient fall-off. They are using more of a threshold technique. This means that if the shadow that is meant to be displayed drops below a certain value, the shadow won't be rendered at all. And if it's above it, it will always look the same. This ends up giving games a very cartoony look. So they have been using this art style in almost every Zelda game ever since. The only one that didn't use it was Twilight Princess. But Skyward Sword also had cel shading graphics, and the same goes for Breath of the Wild. So we can clearly see this trend. However, this isn't all they took from the Wind Waker, since we also see some other classic features. One of these is scanning enemies for their health. We also saw this in the Wind Waker with the hero's charm. And in Breath of the Wild, you can do the exact same, but this time with the Sheikah Slate. They even brought back a similar looking blue tunic in the game. It does look like it a lot, but it's not exactly the same. Now, as soon as you get out of the Shrine of Resurrection at the beginning of the game, you run outside and get a bit of a familiar shot. We have seen this type of view before in a different Zelda game, the first one, which was made over 30 years ago. And this isn't all. They took loads of inspiration from this game, since they essentially went back to the roots of the series. Now, the first Zelda is essentially open world. You have the ability to take different paths to complete the game. Link can freely wander the overworld, finding and buying items at any point. You can do small tasks and side quests for people, do the dungeons in any order, it's all your choice. It's even possible to reach the final boss of the game without taking a sword, but you can't defeat him then. So everything is possible in the first game, and they did the exact same with Breath of the Wild. You start out with some basic gear and some basic stuff, and then you can do anything and go anywhere. They even brought back the Old Man, which you meet in the beginning of both games. But there is even more. The boat makes a return, some of the enemies were based on ones from the first game, and the list goes on and on. A good example of an enemy based on one from the first game is the Guardians. They were based off the Octoroks, since some people said that they were huge looking and made all kinds of complicated movements. So with that in mind, they started to create an enemy. This ended up being the Guardian. They even created a 2D Zelda, which looks a lot like the first game, where they tested some of the mechanics. It was really weird that they did it this way, but apparently it helped them test out new ideas and understand the effects of them, and so they could implement it better into the final 3D game. So yeah, we can clearly see that they went back to the roots of the series, and that's a good thing, since a lot of people like these aspects. But there were also a couple of other items and features planned in Breath of the Wild, which were from previous games. For example, the Stamina Gauge. This was first seen in Skyward Sword and makes a return in this game as well. Now, the only reason why they put this into the game is because of the climbing mechanic, since otherwise, you can just climb forever. This would most likely destroy the entire purpose of the climbing, so that's probably why they added this. And with that, they started to integrate it more and more into the game, with running, combat, and the paraglider. Now that I mentioned that item, that was also taken from Skyward Sword in a sense. In that game, the sailcloth works much like a parachute, as it slows Link's descent when dismounting a loft wing or falling from a considerable height. During the Game Awards of 2014, Miyamoto and Aonuma showed off some early Breath of the Wild gameplay. It demonstrated the skill of Hyrule, and they also showed the use of the sailcloth and the use of beacons for pointing out important landmarks in the huge overworld. In the beginning, they used the sailcloth for gliding, but later on they replaced it with the paraglider. Why? Well, we don't really know. So as you can see, they took a lot of elements from older Zelda games, but also dumped a lot of classic Zelda elements. The developers already said that dumping Zelda conventions was their goal, and they clearly achieved this. However, one fun thing that they were planning for the game, which was from a previous one, was the return of the Minish. They wanted to put in a similar mechanic of Link being able to shrink and walk around and interact in the tiny Minish villages. However, it didn't work in the game, so they had to scrap it. But did they take any inspiration from other games besides Zelda ones? Well, they didn't say anything about it, but some of the mechanics are seen in other ones. Let's start with the climbing. This is seen in a lot of games, so Nintendo wasn't the first one to use this. The most famous example of this ability is seen in the 2005 game Shadow of the Colossus, which was a huge hit on the PlayStation 2. In this game you could climb on the bosses and attack them on a specific point, a bit like the Step Talus. The game is extremely physics-based, which was unbelievable for that time period, since it was pretty new to most players. You had to do a lot of climbing and 3D platforming, so in that regard, it is extremely similar to Breath of the Wild. Now, Nintendo never said that they took inspiration from this game, but to be honest, we can almost be 100% certain that they at least looked at this game a bit, for some clues on how to implement this. The company that made this game, Team Ico, was also from Japan, so Nintendo must have known about them. Shadow of the Colossus did a lot of innovative things, but sometimes it was a bit buggy, so the physics in Breath of the Wild are certainly better. But hey, this game is more than 10 years old, so you could have expected this. However, Nintendo took it a step further and perfected it. Now another thing that they added to Breath of the Wild, which is a completely new combat move, is the Flurry Rush. The combat overall is, as far as I noticed, a bit similar to the Wind Waker, but more expanded upon. However, this new move is completely different from anything we have ever seen, and they probably took this element from a game named Bayonetta. In this game they call it Witch Time, and it slows down time to a fraction of its normal pace. This allows the user to bypass their opponent's defense and execute combinations of attacks and other feats that would otherwise be impossible. So this is extremely similar to the Flurry Rush seen in Breath of the Wild. Now yet again, Nintendo hasn't mentioned that they took inspiration from this game, but it's certainly possible. Bayonetta is a game seen on Nintendo platforms, so they certainly know about it. They also mentioned where they took inspiration from in terms of ancient Sheikah technology. Apparently they took the design patterns from an extremely ancient Japanese culture, from the Yamon period. In this time period, the Japanese were very primitive, and this is around 14,000 to 300 BCE, so that's extremely long ago. During this time, they were rich in tools, pottery figurines and jewelry made from bone, stone, shell and antler. This is the point where we start to see the similarities. The art style of the shrines, guardians and other tech is exactly the same. Besides that, there aren't a lot of connections between the two. They mostly did it for the look of the Sheikah tech. They chose for this because it's unknown to the mainstream, and it was most likely very fitting as well. And I have to say, it does look cool and interesting because of this. Now it also looks like they took some inspiration from other popular open world games like The Witcher and Skyrim. Things like crafting, mini-dungeons and other new elements seen in Breath of the Wild are also seen in those games. However, we have seen this in a ton of games, so I think they just took inspiration from all RPG open world games for those elements. But I specifically mentioned these games because they were huge hits and are the same genre as Breath of the Wild. So of course they took a look at the competition. But that's not a bad thing. A lot of masterpieces were created because they were inspired by other works. Just look at Disney. Almost all their characters are based on folklore in some way. So as you can see, they took quite some inspiration from other cultures, games, and older Zelda games. A lot changed in the series because of this, but in the end, a lot of these changes were a good thing. Also, don't forget to check out my first Breath of the Wild stream highlights video here. I do weekly live streams on Twitch, so be sure to check that out as well. Thanks for watching everybody, don't forget to check out the Game Architects video as well. It will be in the upper right corner, just click the card thingy there, you can just find it, yay! It's a really fun video about the Wind Waker art style, so be sure to check that out as well.